Today's speaker is Dmitry Pavlov, candidate of technical sciences, researcher of LAI. He will talk about a completely new research expedition being planned to the eye of the Sahara. At the end of his talk, you will be able to ask Dmitry all the questions you are interested in.
Hello everyone, I'm glad to see both familiar and unfamiliar faces. Indeed, today's topic relates to a format once common for LAI, last organized by Andrei Sklyarov, who is no longer with us. In a way, this is in his honor. Today I would like to propose that we discuss the idea of a full-scale filming and research expedition, with an element of intrigue, to the eye of the Sahara, also known as the Richat Structure. In literature, one can find plenty of material on the idea that once, somewhere on Earth, specifically, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, there existed the legendary Atlantis. We know about Atlantis thanks to the writings of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. He, in turn, referred to his distant relative in time, because they lived about 200 years apart, the statesman Solon, also an ancient Greek. They were related, and apparently in Plato's family there were documents recording the story of Solon's visit to Egypt. Solon visited one of the ancient Egyptian temples, specifically in the city of Sais, in the Nile Delta, and had long conversations with the priests of this temple. The temple itself has not survived. There are only artistic reconstructions, likely far from the actual appearance, but still sufficient to imagine the atmosphere of the priestly temple. In Sais, Solon received a translation of inscriptions which stated that Egypt itself, long before Solon's time, had been a colony of Atlantis. Atlantis was described as a powerful and advanced state, with 10 provinces and a central capital arranged in a highly unusual way, on 3 islands surrounded by a ring of water separating them, and located not far from the sea. I could leave it at that. I am not a strong supporter of the Atlantis hypothesis and I have not devoted myself to searching for it. But I am primarily interested in Egypt, and the very fact that the Egyptians did not consider themselves to be the original people, but rather a colony of Atlantis, sparks some interest. Why not make certain efforts to either completely disprove the version that Atlantis existed in a specific place, a place associated here with the eye of the Sahara, which I will describe in more detail, or, with a small probability, I estimate it at just a few percent, but that is not insignificant, perhaps we might find some artifacts that make this version more tangible, more serious. Then it could be studied seriously and in depth. Another reason that leads me to look in this direction is the fact that, for example, in the territory of Sais, sphinxes have been found, 7 of them. These are called the Sais sphinxes, with human heads. Some time ago, part of these sphinxes were on display in the Old Cairo Museum. Now there is only one poor quality copy there, with its face broken and restored by modern restorers, frankly, hard to look at. But there is one statue that was only slightly damaged, and you can see how remarkable the facial features are of the figure it represents. The existence of such statues in large numbers in Egypt, along with the pyramids, temples, tombs, sarcophagi, all of this leads me and my colleagues, and above all our leader Andrei Sklyarov, to conclude that there was once a highly developed civilization in Egypt. Not necessarily Atlantis, but judging from the physical monuments we can see, such as this face, the civilization had completely different technical and artistic capabilities than we can ascribe to the Egyptians of the dynastic period. And if suddenly we are lucky, even though the chance is very small, and we find at least a tiny fragment of an ear or a piece of the lips of such a statue in the area of the Richat Structure, then it would be possible to take the legend of Atlantis much more seriously, and proceed with more serious research. Now, reconstructing from Plato's words, the place where the capital of Atlantis stood has been illustrated by an artist as follows. We see the central island, on which the most important buildings of that state, that city, were located. Around it were 2 concentric ring islands, with canals between them, crossed by bridges. Plato's description contains quite a lot of details about Atlantis. One example, to the north of the capital there were beautiful mountains covered with forests, rivers, and waterfalls. To the south there was a canal that connected the ringed structure with the sea. Around it stretched a plain. On the main large ring was a central track where regular horse races were held. The number of buildings, residential, administrative, was significant, as the population of the capital was not small. Plato also mentions 10 provinces under the rule of the capital of Atlantis. Keep that picture in mind and now look at this. Here there are no cities, no water, no bridges, no buildings. But the main structure, a central elevated area, and two ridges encircling it in rings, with depressions between them, is there. It doesn't take much imagination to fill the depressions with water, add structures, and we would have almost exactly Atlantis. The dimensions also match what Plato states. He writes that the largest ring had a diameter of about 23 kilometers. In the case of the Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara, the diameter is about 24 kilometers. The difference is negligible. Another coincidence, the presence of mountains to the north of the structure. They are now desert, but we know that relatively recently the Sahara was not a lifeless desert buried in sand, but a green, fertile land. Accordingly, this place, about 10,000 years ago, could also have been forested, covered in grass, with flowing rivers and waterfalls, just as Plato described. To the south of this structure there is a lowland, which could be interpreted as the outlet to the sea described by Plato. Plato also tells us that in the central part of Atlantis there were two springs, one with cold fresh water, and one with hot fresh water. An unusual feature of the Richat structure is that around this area all the wells contain salt water, except for one place in the central part, exactly where Plato indicated for Atlantis, where according to local accounts fresh water can be drawn from a well, though it is cold. As for hot water, it is unknown, perhaps that source simply hasn't been found. We also see a network of dried riverbeds. One of the largest bends and flows essentially into the center of the Richat structure. It doesn't take much imagination to picture this river occasionally filling after heavy seasonal rains, thus serving as the source of water for the spaces between the concentric ring islands. Here is a computer simulation of the structure with vertical scale exaggerated. You can clearly see the central elevation and the two concentric ring structures around it, and the lowland to the south, which could in theory have connected to a nearby sea. Mountains are visible to the north. On the map, north is at the bottom and south is at the top. As for the origin of the structure, the version of a cosmic impact by a giant body is rejected. There are no traces of impact or an impact crater. The volcanic origin is also rejected. There are no traces of volcanic glass or lava fields. The conclusion, it is not volcanic. The Earth's surface here was once under tectonic stress, bulged upward by perhaps several tens of meters, then changed its mind about erupting, collapsed, and through a combination of subsidence, wind erosion, and water erosion, the strange ring structure we see today was formed. Skeptics who doubt the search for traces of Atlantis here emphasize that this is a natural formation. I don't argue, most, perhaps all, of what we see now is a purely natural formation. But if you think logically, what would have prevented the Atlanteans, or another civilization, perhaps less powerful, from settling on these islands, if they were once islands, and making their settlements here? They might have modified the natural landscape in places, leveling, adding embankments, just as we do. This is a reasonable working assumption. Here we see a geological survey. Different colors and markers indicate different geological structures. Everything here is well studied. There is no mystery about the structure's geological origin. The mystery lies elsewhere, whether the capital of Atlantis, or another settlement, might once have been here. These diagrams show the nature of the ring depressions as seen by geologists, and several slides illustrate, in their view, the main stages of the structure's formation. First, everything bulged up like a dome. Then, without eruption, it began to collapse and simultaneously erode by wind and water. The central part is estimated by geologists to be about 1 billion years old. The outer, larger diameter rings are younger, estimated in the hundreds of millions of years. Naturally, these are not the 10 to 12,000 years that separate us from the time of Atlantis, as claimed by Plato, or Solon. A cross-section shows the trapped magma that never reached the surface, perhaps still dormant beneath the formation. Now to the details of what could be studied and why it's worth organizing an expedition. The location of the Eye of the Sahara is shown on this map. It is in the country of Mauritania. We estimate that the flight, with a transfer in Istanbul in the ideal case, will take about 15 hours. The plane arrives in the Mauritanian capital Nouakchott, difficult to pronounce at first. Here there is an opportunity to rest and gather the group. If there are expedition participants flying in from outside Russia, then in several rented, pre-booked off-road vehicles, the team will drive to the next town, Atta, and from there travel on to a small village not far from the Richat Structure. From there, it is a short distance to the structure itself. The geography is fortunate, the road allows for several stops of interest along the way, details I'll mention later. There is one important difficulty for the version that claims the capital of Atlantis could have been here. The presence of a nearby body of water is contradicted by the elevation of the Richat Structure. On this elevation map you see that the structure is around 400 meters above sea level. Sea levels could not have fluctuated by that amount. Even if all ice melted, we could expect a rise of 60 to 80 meters at most, not 400. On the other hand, a rise of land by 400 meters is also unrealistic. However, there is a possible scenario in which Plato's, or Solon's, words could still be true, and the high elevation of the Richat Structure remains. Looking at the map, you can see there is a ridge, not exactly mountains, but fairly high, about 300 to 400 meters. It's possible that in this place a water basin formed, not an ocean, but an inland sea, something like modern Lake Baikal, which also lies at 500 meters above sea level and holds enormous volumes of water. It's plausible that there was a closed continental sea basin here. This version could be checked on site. In this image, we see well-defined river channels. The rivers have long since dried up, but the sand they once carried remains in the valleys of these channels. On satellite imagery, these riverbeds are clearly visible. Some of these streams are small, with short channels, but there are rivers that run for tens or hundreds of kilometers across the highlands. In this image we see a riverbed starting from the plateau and flowing directly into the main ring of the Richat Structure. Perhaps this river was the main water source filling the ring canals. This possibility can and should be checked. Another interesting feature around the Richat Structure is the sand dunes, marked in yellow. We see characteristic grooves stretching for kilometers, which is striking when we recall that the diameter from edge to edge is about 50 kilometers. The central part of the structure is about 24 kilometers, and the outer shores, if we may call them that, are around 50 kilometers. Now about the sand. This sand lies here in such quantities, with such characteristic grooves. The question is, did it arrive by air, carried by winds, or by water? At first glance, it's not obvious. I think this is another point worth studying on site. At least visually, as a non-specialist, I have the impression that this sand, at least in its main mass, was deposited by water, the result of some catastrophic flood or tsunami. You can see how this sand presses up against the ridge, which at one time may have held back the water of this sea. One could suppose that at some point water simply broke through the ridge. And then the flood began. As water flows, it erodes and increases the mass of outflowing water. This could have triggered avalanche-like hydrodynamic disasters. We see how the sand breaks into stream-like traces, here, at the base of the Richat Structure, and here as well. On both sides, like a peninsula, the sand probably, along with water, flowed further toward the Atlantic Ocean in two powerful streams, here and here, descending into the ocean. Here's another image. We also see these traces, in the upper part on the Richat Structure, and below. The source of this water seems to head off to the right. On the elevation map we see the Richat Structure here, connected by a continuous lowland to the Mediterranean Sea. If we allow for the possibility that about 12,000 years ago, if we believe Plato, some volcano erupted in the Mediterranean Sea, this is possible, since in recorded history there have been such eruptions. Under certain conditions they can generate giant tsunami waves. If such a wave was directed toward this coast, it is entirely plausible that a wave tens or even hundreds of meters high could have swept across all of northwest Africa, eventually reaching the Richat Structure, flowing through it, and cascading down to the western coast. This is also suggested by the relief of Africa. We see this lowland, emphasized by the sand lines which still cover much of the surface, flowing around the Richat Structure and extending west. There is an astonishing study, a purely hydrological one, which shows that opposite the western coast of Mauritania, at the end of the continental shelf, there is a tongue of debris and sand. They call it a submarine landslide. It covers a vast area, about 200 by 300 kilometers, with sediment thicknesses reaching hundreds of meters. In the enlarged vertical cross-section we see the ocean bottom, the drop-off where the continental shelf ends. This top layer is the mass of deposits, formed probably not once but multiple times. Such events could have repeated over millennia. The latest catastrophic water flow likely carried new masses of sand. In that study, they state that the age of the upper deposits of this submarine landslide is about 11,000 years. This is an unsettling coincidence. After all, Plato and the authors of this hydro-technical study certainly didn't coordinate their stories. Once again we return to the satellite images. The tongue lies exactly between the two sand flows frozen in place, leading to the ocean. During this expedition we will not be able to engage in deep ocean retrieval of debris. That is a much more expensive and complex operation. But remember I mentioned that the capital of Mauritania and the road to the Richat Structure conveniently runs along the edge of these sand masses, which may have been deposited by ancient water flows. This means that if we devote time and attention to studying the edges of these sand flows, we could, if there are interesting fragments, identify them as having been carried from the direction of the Richat Structure. In other words, if Atlantis or another settlement with human-made structures had existed here, its debris should be scattered across this area. By simply walking along the former watercourses, at the boundary between undisturbed ground and the zones where water passed, we might have the good fortune to discover interesting fragments. The most characteristic places that must be examined I have marked with numbers. Number 1. Large sand masses carried by water onto the Richat Structure itself. Number 2. The mouth of the main large river that perhaps brought its water into the inner rings of the structure. If a tsunami passed here, it would likely have flowed upstream partially into this channel. This is another search zone. Number 3 to 4, along the border between sand and undisturbed plateau. At point 4 there is an interesting formation, at least from the satellite image, crossing the former flow, perhaps a channel or quarry. On site we must see what it is. Part of the water seems to have flowed off along this channel, with a small stream carrying sand toward the ocean. These places could hold interesting finds. Number 5, another promising location to check. Number 6, the capital of Mauritania on the coast. As we discussed, here there is the submarine landslide. Some of the sand masses that reached the sea may have left fragments on the shore. Local residents may find interesting things after storms. At local markets we could try our luck in finding something carried here by the ancient tsunami. It is also worth examining what types of rocks form the strange white patches in the area. The most likely version is salt flats, which would support the idea that this place was once submerged. If the water had been marine, then after evaporation the salt would remain on the surface. In the central part of the central island we should also look for traces of the ancient well, or the newer well used by locals. If what they say about fresh cold water is true, this is significant. Several general views of the structure as we will see it on site. Here, I think, is a view of the plateau. The elevation from the base to the top is about 200 meters, a considerable height. The inner elevations within the Richat Structure are relatively low hills, at most tens of meters. But if we fill the depressions with water, these tens of meters become full-fledged islands. On the surfaces of these islands we see scattered stones, suspiciously evenly broken. I'm not making predictions, but the very fact of evenly shattered rocks could suggest that a destructive wave once passed here, leaving these broken stone fragments. Another characteristic photo, the stones themselves are very reminiscent of images from Mars rovers, landscapes with rocks of dark blue and turquoise hues. It would be curious to encounter them here and examine what kind of rock this is. And views of the hills and depressions. Finally, we must remember that the expedition to the Richat Structure will not be living in comfortable hotels. There are no settlements nearby, the nearest being tens of kilometers away. All days of research there we will have to live in tents, or for some, in vehicles. The very idea of spending several days in the desert, at a time that is neither the hottest nor the coldest, given the sharp daily temperature swings, will for many bring back memories of youth. And finally, summarizing everything said above, I outline the current objectives of the expedition, not a full list. This will be refined in preparation, and on site, plans may change. Reach the location with a group of specialists. Despite planes and vehicles, this is a serious journey to a non-tourist country. Examine the channels of dried rivers to see what can be observed there. Assess the likelihood that these rivers once carried enough water to fill the ring depressions and possibly a nearby sea. Determine whether there was in the past a catastrophic water flow near the Richat structure. I personally lean toward the tsunami hypothesis, but this is still a hypothesis and must be verified on site. We must also consider whether wind transport alone could have produced the sand patterns. If a tsunami or catastrophic flood occurred, identify what debris remains and where. These are the numbered locations we plan to check. If we are lucky, we may find something man-made. Verify reports of a freshwater source in the center of the Richat structure. Since we plan to have a geologist with appropriate equipment, we may also look for signs of a hot water source. This is plausible, since we have discussed the possibility of a failed volcano here, and heating could still be occurring below. If we are fortunate, and we can rent on site a motor drill or a small portable drilling rig, we could even try drilling down several dozen meters. With luck, we might be able to open the hot and cold springs mentioned. Seventh objective, determine the composition of the white patches on the surface of the Richat structure. As I have said, this list of objectives may be expanded, both by us and by suggestions from viewers of our YouTube channel. I hope the video will be released soon. We welcome proposals on what and how could be measured and examined by the resources of a relatively small expedition. The composition of such an expedition is envisioned as 5 to 6 specialists, including the leader, myself, as administrator. A person well versed in African realities, this will be Dmitry Pavlov, same surname, no relation. He often accompanied Andrei Sklyarov on expeditions, including to Ethiopia and other countries, and has extensive experience dealing with African organizations. He is now developing our route and contacts with locals to make the expedition as safe and as logistically smooth as possible. Dangers do exist, and while comfort cannot be promised, we aim to minimize problems. An operator or two, everything we will see, test, and study must be documented for the film. Even if we do not find anything sensational, the film will still be valuable. The Richat structure is a remarkable geological formation, and the expedition is full-scale research. It will be interesting regardless of whether we find artifacts. A geologist, we have candidates. A hydrologist, if possible. An archaeologist, although we do not yet know what could be excavated, if we are lucky, such a specialist could be valuable. The expedition may also include individuals we call conditional sponsors. The funding of this expedition can come in 2 ways. Support from viewers and followers, organizing a crowdfunding campaign, as we did for the excavation of the Pyramid of Sekhemkhet and the Landrosh film. These projects were completed successfully. This would be the 3rd such project. Private participants who can cover their own costs and sponsor a specialist, that is, paying for themselves and one expert. We have made preliminary estimates, with flights from Moscow to the capital of Mauritania and back, plus all expenses on site. The cost per person is about €4,000. If a sponsor covers their own costs and those of a specialist, this would be about €8,000. There are already several interested individuals considering ways to find the necessary funds. I myself once went with Sklyarov to Mexico as such a participant. I personally fully funded an expedition to Egypt. Later, in Mexico, Sklyarov applied this same method, inviting several sponsors who paid for themselves and a specialist. The Mexican expedition was quite successful, and I recall that team fondly. I would like to experience such an expedition again, this time to Mauritania. So, don't hesitate, I promise this journey will be interesting even if there never was any Atlantis there. To add some incentive for fundraising, as we did with the Pyramid of Sekhemkhet and the Androsh film, we will also hold a lottery. We cannot include a spot in the expedition, too expensive, but we can include 1 or 2 fully paid 5-day tours of Egypt, pyramids around Cairo, as prizes. This is to encourage interest in co-financing the expedition. Contributions can be of any size, from small amounts upwards, no upper limit. That's all. Join us on Atlant.gg for 2 incredible adventures. In October, a land expedition to the legendary Eye of the Sahara. In November, we set sail into the Atlantic Ocean, exploring the continental shelf and searching for artifacts swept away by time. Atlant.gg, your gateway to discovery. Come with us. Thank you for your attention. I am ready to answer questions.
Good afternoon, I was delayed. Could you comment on the two meteorite craters that are in a straight line with the Richat structure? Is there any theory?
I have seen these craters in photographs sent to various groups. Honestly, I have no theory. One thing I can say with certainty, the Richat structure itself is not a meteorite crater. This is 99.9% proven by geologists. I see no point in opposing professional opinion, although of course unexpected things happen, we will see on site. As for traveling to those craters to compare similarities, I think it's premature. That would be an even more complex expedition, requiring strong justification. The fact that two craters and the Richat structure lie on a straight line is not, in my opinion, sufficient grounds by itself.
You mentioned that the highway to the Richat structure conveniently passes near interesting locations. What can be seen along the way?
These interesting spots I have marked on this satellite image. At point 6 is approximately the capital of Mauritania. The highway, I cannot say exactly how it runs, but if we draw a straight line, it is close to the edge of the sand mass. We are interested in the outermost sand flow. The Richat structure, if affected by the flow, was only touched at its edge because it lies on the boundary of the highlands. The main flow passed elsewhere. The most interesting material should be on the boundary, the border between sand and undisturbed ground. This is where we should make the most stops, to check depressions, hollows, and riverbeds where water may have entered and left debris. If among these stones we see worked surfaces, we will need to analyze them. We already know how, in Egypt, we often collected fragments of worked stone lying nearby, ignored by others. On the surfaces of these hard stone sculptures we found microscopic metal particles, tens of microns, indicating unusual tool composition used by ancient builders. If we find similar fragments here, intact pieces are unlikely unless buried, with similar metallic inclusions from tools, it would be powerful evidence linking this area with Egypt, which Plato claimed was a colony of Atlantis.
You mentioned a particular crack or canyon near point 5. Why is it interesting?
This canyon is suspiciously straight. Point the 5th of May also connect to an outlet farther down. The small sand flow here may prove very interesting. Visiting this site is one of our tasks.
Why are the circles of the Richat structure so geometrically regular? Usually geological forms are chaotic, but this is very precise. And why hasn't it been covered by sand?
As for why the whole eye of the Sahara is not covered by sand, perhaps it once was, and wind has blown it off some parts. Or perhaps the flood only affected it partially. It is better to suppose that water circulated here as a giant whirlpool, carrying sand, eroding surfaces. But don't forget, 12,000 years have passed. Aeolian, wind, processes also play a role. As for the geometric regularity, if an underground bubble formed, as geologists suspect for the origin of the structure, then, by physical properties, the bulge will be circular. When we inflate a bubble, it is not surprising it is spherical or close to it. Here, if some mass from below pressed upward, deforming the Earth's crust, the resulting elevation took on circular contours. Later, as geologists explain, faults formed inside this bubble. The top did not erupt, as it might have if pressure had exceeded strength and gravity, but instead partially collapsed, leaving the ring form. Instead of erupting, the dome gradually broke apart and subsided. In the process, it fractured into circular segments. Why circular? Honestly, if you look carefully at the Earth's surface, the Richat structure is not the only such ring formation. Even nearby there are places, here, you can see another ring with a central elevation. So, the Richat structure is unique only in terms of its gigantic size. Smaller ring formations occur on Earth, and they are not meteorite impact craters. These are natural geological features. Therefore, I don't see a particular mystery as to why the structure is ring-shaped. Yes, it is beautiful, but why not? Of course, among the thousands or hundreds of thousands of theories proposed, including about the Richat structure and Atlantis, they occupy one of the top places in popularity. But I try to approach such sensational statements with skepticism. Traces of Atlantean weapons or some failed experiment would matter to me only if we found evidence. When we talk about Egypt, there is evidence that we are dealing with something extraordinary. Talking about extraterrestrial involvement in the construction of pyramids, temples, sculptures is permissible because we have physical objects we can study, for example, microscopic metal shavings on the surfaces of worked stone objects. There is nothing mystical here. You analyze the composition of those metal particles and ask which ancient Egyptians could smelt steel with such alloying elements. The reasonable answers are two. A highly developed civilization preceding the Egyptians, which perished. Or, as Andrei Sklyarov liked to consider, a paleocontact, an expedition arrived, deliberately or due to some accident, and created many structures. In Egypt there is at least a basis for these hypotheses. Here, on the Richat Structure, to say Atlantis based only on a circular shape is, at the very least, premature.
I checked and found that Nouakchott has the National Museum of Mauritania. Perhaps we should include a visit in the expedition program?
Yes, that is a good addition. If anything unusual has been found in Mauritania, it is likely stored in this museum. As with Andrei Sklyarov, we regularly included visits to local archaeological museums in expedition plans. We will certainly visit it, as well as the local markets, because among the items sold by villagers, there might accidentally appear small figurines thousands of years old.
I don't know whether the legend of Atlantis is just Plato's imagination. But if we reconstruct the possible destruction of Atlantis here by flood or water catastrophe, and suppose there were large structures, probably stone, on these islands, taking into account centrifugal and centripetal forces, how would the remains of large structures and small valuable objects be distributed? Would they be deposited at the edges, or all swept into the sea? There are no large blocks visible.
I have emphasized that the natural stones now covering the surface of the Richat structure have a fairly uniform size. This may indirectly indicate that the force of the disaster that passed here was so great that stones were literally shattered. Any that protruded above a certain level surface would have been broken. Therefore, if there had been human-built structures on the islands, a flow of such force, and you can see how much sand it carried, would have destroyed them completely. A tsunami wave perhaps hundreds of meters high could have swept through here. As it hit, following the physical laws, a whirlpool would form inside the structure. The speed of rotation would also be catastrophic, grinding everything and then carrying it away as the water receded, moving downward. Places where I think fragments are most likely to remain are natural cracks. There should be many here. If there are anthropogenic depressions, cellars, wells, if we find such depressions, they should be excavated, and on the bottom or in the middle we may find fragments that were carried there by the water and trapped, later buried under layers. Also, as I have said, the most promising area for finding debris carried out of the rings of the structure is along the boundary, looking slightly upstream in the dry riverbeds. And the channel farther down is especially promising. Someday, if we find something significant here, I think scientists will later dig through that submarine landslide I showed earlier, described in the technical study. Among millions of tons of sand, fragments of structures destroyed here could occasionally be found, if, of course, there were any structures here at all. I fully allow that there may never have been any large settlement here, perhaps only shepherds' huts, then as now. They obviously do not resemble Atlantis. We do not position our expeditions as purely searches for Atlantis. Rather, they are to answer the question, what was Plato talking about, and can we dispel this legend if there is basis to? Still, in our hearts, many of us in LAI are romantics, and we are not against dreaming about discovering traces of Atlantis in these nearby areas.
If there are no more questions, then we will conclude our lecture. We thank you for being with us today. We hope that through the efforts of people who care about the history of our distant past, this expedition will take place. And in the near future we will have many interesting discoveries. Thank you all very much. Until we meet again.
Спасибо, Дмитрий. Спасибо.
The Laboratory of Alternative History and Atta's Club invite you to take part in a fascinating and educational expedition to ancient Egypt. During this journey you will study in detail the evidence of the construction of pyramids and temples by an ancient highly developed civilization. Immerse yourself in the mysterious world of theories of space and time. Discuss, together with LAI guides, the mysteries of matter and the universe. The expedition includes visits to dozens of pyramids, tours of the most famous tombs and temples. Details are in the description of the video.